Good evening, everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at the Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's program, Coping Effectively with Big Feelings, Strategies to Metabolize Unsettling Feelings. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask that audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. Our next program is the Piet Audolph story, Gardening Design, which will take place digitally via Zoom on Thursday, April 28th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Tonight's program is brought to you by the Rochester Area Youth Assistance, or RAYA. RAYA is a prevention-based nonprofit organization that has been serving the Rochester community for decades. All services and programs provided by RAYA are available at no cost to school-age youth who reside in the Rochester Community Schools District. Services and programs include family education, which has workshops, classes, and presentations like the one you are attending tonight, financial assistance for student expenses such as sports, lessons, or tutoring, and counseling, confidential short-term counseling by our certified caseworker. RAYA also hosts an annual youth recognition banquet, partnered with RARA to offer Camp Safari to lower-income families, and offers a Mentors Plus mentoring program. The goal of RAYA is to strengthen youth and families and prevent delinquency. And now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Dr. James Jones.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? So, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm happy to be back here at the Public Library. And so thank you, Public Library, and thank you to Raya for having me come and talk to you tonight. Excuse me. Since it's a small group, I think that's going to make for a better discussion at the end. We might be able to talk more. So I'm going to try and keep it a little bit tight. And so we have plenty of time to talk about what you might want to talk about related to our topic. So we'll see what I can do. I guess just a little tiny bit about me. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Rochester Hills. Moved back here after graduate school and have raised my family here and have a little private practice out kind of by the courthouse off Barclay Circle. And I see adolescents, adults, and couples. So, some of the symptoms of major mental illness, such as hearing voices or the black hole style depressive episodes that some people have, are hopefully something that most of us will never ever encounter. So I thought it would be interesting for us to explore something that affects all of us. I put big feelings in the title to denote those moments in which our emotional reactions swell within us to the point where they threaten to overwhelm us. And sometimes they do overwhelm us, which I'm sure you can all identify with. And I'm not only talking about anxiety, although that's a very legitimate big feeling that can really be destructive to us. I'm talking about any sorts of feelings. Even positive feelings can be overwhelming to us. Tonight we're probably going to focus more on the negative ones. So we have just a little over an hour and time for questions. So what I hope to get through is to cover from where do the big feelings come? When do we develop our ability to manage and metabolize those feelings? And what can we do now in order to cope with them effectively and metabolize them? So, as you know, our feelings that hit us happen from the outside, like witnessing a terrible car accident, or hearing devastating news that people are being killed in a war overseas, or getting dumped by someone you love. Those things that happen from the outside do not affect all of us in the same way. The very same external event, an objective event, like two cars crashing together, if there are 10 people that witnessed it, you will have 10 different vantage points, resulting in 10 different experiences of that accident. Our inside reaction to these events is based on many variables. These variables include our genetically inherited capacity to process incoming stimuli. Some people are more overwhelmed than others, more quickly, just temperamentally. Sometimes it depends on the current social context within which one of these things might happen. If you're at a party and something happens and you're in a mood or altered somehow and something happens, you're going to process that differently than you would if you were at church or somewhere. And our potential history of maybe having been hurt or scared or helpless in our past also informs how we react. And lastly, our ability to regulate our affect. And when I say affect, I basically mean our feelings and emotions. Our ability to regulate our affect will affect how we process things. And we're going to talk more about affect regulation in just a minute. We can have big, overwhelming feelings based solely on inside stuff. Waking up from a nightmare, for instance, the recollection of a traumatic event in your past, remembering there's something terrible going on in the world, or waking up each morning only to remember that your spouse of 50 years has died. In a way, all of it is inside stuff. There are events that happen out here, right? But nothing matters out there until it's in here. That's where the reactions happen. So in a way, it's sort of an inside job. And you remember that old saying about a tree falling in the woods, and if no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is yes, but nobody's there to hear it, and it doesn't affect anyone. When big feelings hit us, oh, and by the way, as I'm talking, please feel free if you have a comment or question. We have plenty of space tonight to do that sort of thing. So when big feelings hit us, we seem also to have a lightning fast capacity to assess our ability to deal with that emotional load. So it's not only dependent on this that comes at us. There's also this very quick process within our minds that evaluates how we think we're going to be able to handle it. It's as if somewhere inside we say something like, oh gosh, this is terrible. I'm feeling very upset, and I'm pretty sure I can't handle it. Except it happens lightning fast, and it's not really verbal at all. And even though many of the things that we tell ourselves in those moments, usually anxiety stories, even though those things aren't true, we can react as if they were true, and our bodies can certainly react as if those things are true. Like, our reaction is like, I'm dead, or they're going to hate me, or I'm going to pass out, I'm going to puke, I'm going to have a panic attack. Mostly those things don't happen, and hopefully they don't happen tonight. In some ways, I try to help people recognize their feelings and express them and find words for them, but also to develop approaches that allow less panic and more confidence so that they can deal effectively with the feelings when they cannot be avoided. So let's talk about a bit where these capacities come from. To start with, I'm going to talk about the slides that I'm not advancing. This is review, and that is coming. To start with, I'm going to start talking about our ability to manage big feelings by going in what might sound like a surprising direction, and get a little nerdy about two important bits of research that concern the first 3 or so years of life. The first is by talking about a model of affect regulation that gradually develops when we're little. And then I'll share a specific bit of research that has a more general application to our topic today. So first, let's talk about affect regulation. The structure and framework in our minds, and when I say mind, I mean brain. It's all brain. It's all we've got. It's just brain. We think of mind as something a little bit more than that. I've come kicking and screaming to the position that it's just brain. So all of this happens in our brain, but I prefer to say mind. So the structure and framework for dealing effectively with big feelings starts early in our lives, long before we have words, in the mother-infant dyad. And when I say mother, I'm talking about the person who's doing the job. I don't care who it is. Whoever's doing the job, feeding, holding, all the things, that's the mother in this talk. In the mother-infant dyad is where the capacity to regulate affect starts. Without getting too deep into it, the little one has little or no capacity to regulate itself before about 6 months old. And so it is entirely dependent on the mothering one to help it regulate its affect. The developmental neuroscientists have even narrowed down through their research and studies of PET scans and MRIs and things, that these interactions that take place between the mothering one and the infant are right brain to right brain communications, mostly visually. The researchers have found that most of our brain specialization and growth takes place postnatally, so after we're born, and is experience dependent. So probably this makes sense given the mechanics of birth, but your brain is so big when you're born, but the specialization that happens, which includes the growth of the neurons within it, the pruning of the bits and regions that are not used so much, that all leads to structuralization and specialization. And most of it takes place after we're born and is experience dependent. So it's interpersonal. If your early life is very rich with love and warmth and stimuli and the good stuff, your brain will develop better than if you were born, unfortunately, with great deprivation, or if you were raised in an orphanage somewhere where there's no way they could care for every kid well because there's just too many kids and not enough people. It's not going to be the same rich environment, so that little brain is not going to develop the same way. They're pretty resilient, but it's not going to develop the same way. Consequently, the early interactions between mother and infant, comprised of thousands of micro moments, lead to actual structural change in the brain of the little one. So let's talk about a pattern that develops. When the mother is attuned, she is, again, it's mostly she's, but it's not always she's. The mother, it's when she is emotionally present, when she's empathic and well connected with the little one. They understand the little one's changing states and respond automatically, because none of this is done through words or even really conscious thought. There are moments of misattunement when she's off. Mother's preoccupied, mother's depressed, mother's playing on the iPhone, whatever. If she's emotionally distant or otherwise unavailable, that can lead to moments of misattunement, which literally leads to disorganization in the little one. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. Reattunement is when they get back on track. When the mother, the primary caregiver, gets back on track, adjusts empathically, and then they are in synchrony once again. There are very interesting studies by Steven Seligman where they showed video, a split screen video of simultaneous faces, mother, infant. So they were happening at the same time. And the one that I remember, it was a kiddo who was a little bit more than 6 months old. But here's what happened, and it'll illustrate what I'm talking about. And this was a normal mom and a normal baby. No pathology, everybody's healthy and fine. Normal mom, normal baby. She's engaging the little one in play, and the little one is responding like it likes it. And she keeps doing it, but does it a little bit too long, right? Does it a little bit too long, and you see the little one, in this case, look away, which by looking away, that down-regulates the moment, and then re-engages her. At the very same time that the little one looks back to her, she leans back a little tiny bit. And none of this is conscious. This is just a tiny moment, right? So think about this same couple, and they were trying to come up with a model for what having a depressed mother might be like. Because when we're very, very depressed, our affect is flat, our faces are pretty flat, and it's pretty rough on everybody. So they were trying to come up with a way to mimic that for the study. And so they simply had the mom do what they called the still face paradigm, where, and I'm not going to be able to do it because I'm going to smile, but the mother, this is, again, normal. The mom just cuts off the feelings from her face. And the little one instantly reacts to that and tries to elicit something interesting, but she's holding this. And the little one down-regulates by looking away and then tries to re-engage again, and she keeps that hold. And within fewer than 45 seconds, the little one's body movements were discoordinated, and it was drooling, and it was becoming disorganized. It was really hard to watch, right? Or to hear. That's just one. Oh, and then she snapped back. She dropped the still face, smiled again, and the little one re-engaged, and they were fine. So that's kind of an exaggerated moment of what could have been attunement, real misattunement, and then reattunement at the end of it. Those moments of attunement, misattunement, reattunement are what are the basis for affect regulation and the development of early confidence and hope in the ways that follow. The cycle of AMR gets repeated thousands of times and gets internalized, set up on the inside. If we put adult language to it, or to those moments, it would be something like, everything is just fine, oh my gosh, nothing is fine, this is terrible, I feel terrible, and then, oh geez, oh, okay, that's much better, right? With the reattunement. The reattunement part is pivotal because we will, as parents, caregivers, we are going to be misattuned. We are going to drop the ball. We're going to be preoccupied. We're going to monkey it up sometimes. That's fine. The reattunement, though, is the pivotal part. If there's no reattunement, then you guys are in trouble. But with the reattunement, then you're back on track. But you can hear in that, fine, not fine, fine again, right? That gets internalized thousands of times and starts setting up a structure on the inside that allows the little one gradually to know, okay, this is terrible. I feel terrible, but I'm going to be okay, right? But I'm going to be okay is essential. It's one of the earliest forms of confidence and hope. With that early hope, I'm going to be okay, we start developing increasing capacities to have big feelings and reactions. But also know that we'll be able to weather them, survive them just fine, and be okay in a bit. Not all of us are great at this, right? Some of you under-regulate and are prone to lots of anxiety breakthrough, and that's rough. Some people over-regulate. They don't let things bother them, and they're more impassive or stoic. Not that stoic, but colloquially stoic. And so they don't let things bother them, but actually things are bothering them on the inside. So there's really no escape from it. But not all of us are great at it. Sometimes it's just because of our biology. Sometimes early parenting was not ideal. And with the early parenting stuff, I'm not a blame the mother kind of therapist. The early parenting issues are usually based on a mismatch between the mom's capacities and the little one's needs and capacities. When there's too great a mismatch, trouble is more likely, and difficult attachment styles are more likely. But that's nobody's fault when there's a mismatch. Nobody chooses to be mismatched. Let's see. Modern parenting has probably gone too far in the way of protecting our kids from uncomfortable feelings. Probably a topic for another time. But our ability to deal with these things is not unlike our developing immune system. Our immune system evolutionarily has come to be this amazing system that increases in strength and sophistication the more it encounters bacteria and dirt and yuck. It gets stronger for having been exposed to those things. Our affect regulation and those capacities works a bit the same way. And I'm not saying we should let our kids be overwhelmed with awfulness or harmed. I don't mean that. But I do mean they can fall down. They can wipe out on a bike. They can climb a tree with a little bit of supervision. They can do those. They can be frustrated. They could not come in first. Their team can get creamed, in baseball. And not everybody's going to get ribbons. And I'm not going to talk about that much, but it's okay to be really disappointed about something because you're going to be okay. You might try it a little harder next time. It might really suck that night, but you're going to be okay. So that's a model of affect regulation. Let me now share with you an example of modified empathy. And empathy, as opposed to compassion, empathy is our ability to sample and feel a little bit of what somebody else is going through. Okay? Compassion's way easier and probably more useful to us. Empathy is harder, can really confuse us, but that is the ability to feel how the other one feels. This is essential in the mother-infant dyad because babies are completely terrible about telling you how they feel in words. So her ability to feel something, a little bit of what the little one is feeling, that helps her know. So that empathy is essential. Empathy in our adult lives is, I think, a little overrated. There's a really great book by Paul Bloom about it called The Case Against Empathy, if you want to be half pissed and surprised about a premise, but it's really an interesting book. So, modified empathy and how that can serve as a model for what we can do for ourselves later in our lives. There is a capacity that we have that researchers have come to call the reflective function. And the reflective function, that construct simply means that we have the ability to know that somebody outside of us has their own mind and is motivated and affected by their own stuff. That may seem trivial, but it's huge. When we're in more selfish states, you've heard the phrase of like, that person doesn't see past the end of their own nose, right? They're only thinking about themselves. We can all be that way sometimes, of course, especially when we're super anxious or unwell. But the ability to take another's perspective, to know that they have their own mind and their own feelings for their own reasons, that's the reflective function. There's a cool little bit of research I'm going to throw in about how you test this, and it'll make sense to you. You can take toddlers, and the reflective function usually isn't in place till about 3 or 4 years old. I mean, it's not fully in place, but it's getting there. So you can test kids. So imagine there's a kid under study. You have another kid who's working for you. He's a confederate to the researcher, and the researcher's there with a white lab coat. This little kid who's under study witnesses Billy come in with a chocolate bar, and Billy puts the chocolate bar in the basket right in front of this kid. And then the little kid leaves. And then the researcher takes the piece of chocolate out of the basket, puts it across the room in a box, and then simply asks the kid, when Billy comes back, where will he look for the chocolate? Now, if you have this reflective function, if you can hold in your mind the fact that somebody else has their own mind and their own thoughts, the kid can say, well, he's going to look in the basket because that's where he knew it, that's where he left it. So of course he's going to look there, right? But the kid who doesn't have the reflective function has no choice but to answer to what he knows to be true, which is it's in the box. Does that make sense to you? Right? Very clever stuff that developmental people can do. And nobody's hurt, unlike the next study I'm going to tell you. So, as they're trying to figure out this stuff about reflective function, they did this amazing study because there's theory and research to suggest that the better you are at this reflective function, the better able you're going to be empathic, right? And the better able you're going to be to soothe your kiddo. And one of the things I want to emphasize this morning is that this function I'm talking about right now and affect regulation start young and are interpersonally mediated, mother-infant. But over time, with internalization of these functions, we become independent and we start doing them on our own. So, in order to do a study that tests how quickly a mother can soothe their kid, that's ethically problematic, right? You can't just, this isn't Nazi Germany, so you can't just harm infants and toddlers and then time the mom to see how quickly she can soothe the baby. That's very impolite, right? But what you can do is you can go to naturalistic settings where they always hurt kids and time them there. And that, of course, is at the pediatrician's office, where the kids get their immunizations. If you're parents and you immunized your kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because when your little kid goes in there to get those shots, they are intermuscular shots. I swear they are this big. And those little chubby thighs, it looks like they're going to pierce their femurs. Anyway, they give them this huge poke, and it really hurts, right? Now, the only thing worse than not getting that is not getting it because, vaccinations. So you've got this naturalistic setting where they're going to hurt kids, and then their mom or dad or somebody's going to be there to soothe them. That's when you can time them. And what they found was that the mothers, always mothers, the mothers who had the highest scores in the reflective function were better able to soothe their kids than were the mothers who were purely empathic. The mothers who were purely empathic, my wife was one, would just cry with the baby. She'd be in tears, kiddo would be in tears. It was awesome. Because my wife has a huge heart. She's amazing. So I had to do it because I'm cold-hearted, right? What they found was in the mothers that had a higher reflective function, they offered something more than empathy. It was empathy, and I literally can't do this one. There is a face that will betray her capacity to know that this hurts like hell, but that you're going to be okay. And there was more teasing and sing-songiness and a little bit of playfulness in the moments while she was also expressing I know that hurts, buddy. That modified empathy, what I think of as empathy plus hope, is what was associated with the better capacity to soothe the little one. So the affect regulation idea shows that we have this newly developed capacity to know we'll be okay even when we're experiencing big and disruptive feelings. As we learn from the soothing study, that it takes a modified form of empathy to soothe and settle when babies are in distress. Like I said a few minutes ago, it's important to remember that these are interpersonally moderated at the beginning, but that over time and as we mature, we take over those functions. My work as a psychotherapist often involves me helping people directly express their feelings. Sometimes it's just bearing witness to them. We explore the current and historical sources of the feelings, and we try to figure out what to do about them if they are feeling overwhelmed. It's also kind of great if we can figure out a way that they can completely avoid them in the future, but that can be a little tricky because our lives are filled with plenty of things that can be profoundly sad or scary, complicated emotionally in relation to other people, and sometimes downright dangerous. So naming and differentiating feelings is something I do, even though it's a simple idea, that proves to be invaluable. Having words for your feelings, rather than just the body-based sort of emotional affect, having words lifts it. It's a secondary level of abstraction. This is why in toddlerhood, when they really start picking up language, it really helps them to express themselves, rather than just having to throw a fit or fall apart. The people that are best able to put words to their feelings are best able to manage and regulate their affect. The people that aren't very good at that, for reasons, are actually vulnerable to not just emotional overwhelm, but the people who don't have words for their feelings are also very susceptible to psychosomatic disorders. Real physical problems, but whose origin is actually psychological. GI, anything that affects the GI, eczema, later probably eating disorders and cutting and things like that, substance abuse disorders, things where they're having to do other things kind of outside themselves to regulate the inside part. There's an extreme condition called alexithymia, where people have no words for their feelings. And they're the ones that suffer most with psychosomatic problems. My job also involves helping people simply accept how they do feel and normalizing how they do feel. It's very rare that somebody has a feeling in my office that I find unreasonable. You might not like how you feel, right? You might be furious murderously furious with someone that you love. And because you love them, it's a conflict, right? It's going to make you anxious. It's going to be very uncomfortable. But everybody feels that way sometimes. Any of you who've had kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about if you're honest. You know that at some points with a colicky kid or sleep deprivation, that you had the most horrible ideas that came to your mind. My daughter had a very brief period of colic. It wasn't even a terrible case of it, but it was like I would get home at 7-ish, and that's when she would crank up. And that was also when my wife would be very sure that it was my turn because she'd done duty all day, right? And so I'd get this screaming kid that I could do nothing about. Nothing I would do would soothe her. And remember, nothing I could do. And I remember one time I had this fantasy hit my mind, like, is there a way I can throw her out the window where she won't be hurt? Right? It captures the whole thing. Murderous impulse. Makes perfect sense in that moment. Very impolite to do, by the way. You can't throw the baby out the window because of gravity. But the fantasy makes sense. Like to rid yourself of this thing that's causing such great turmoil. But immediately, the other part of the fantasy was in a way that she doesn't get hurt, because of course I love her and I'm not a monster. Anyway, so you want to have words for your feelings, and you also want to be very tolerant of yourself when you do have very strange or weirdo feelings, because I can assure you they make sense on some level. They're just feelings, just thoughts, just fantasies. Those are harmless, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But people don't quite believe me when I say that. Big feelings in the present might be the result of something terrible or tragic that is going on right now around us. As I said earlier, sometimes the big feelings are not the result of outside stuff, but more inside stuff. But all of the reactions come from within us. I also have found in my work that in those moments where you have a giant reaction to something in the present, but it seems disproportionate to the present moment, like we got in this huge fight, but it was over something so stupid. Like something about the present moment is reminding you of something else. And that's what usually complicates it. So those disproportionate moments, that's usually because the present moment is somehow reminding you of something. And that sort of filters down into the deeper recesses of your mind and finds these cavities and reservoirs of old feelings that are unmetabolized and not diminished by time. So this new moment can drill down into this, and then all of a sudden there'll be an upsurge of very big feelings, even though they just left their underwear on the living room floor, right? It's like, well, that's not great, but it's certainly not a screaming match issue, right? Even if it's the 1,000th time she's told you. One of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves, and I'm happy to teach my patients, is the elegant and simple question, why am I feeling this? We often have feelings, thoughts, and fantasies, and then immediately react to them as if they are real and as if they are a real call to action. And they are neither, and that is very good news. We have thoughts and feelings and fantasies that come into our minds, and we don't control any of it. It just flies in. That's a little disturbing to some people, but we don't choose those things. They just fly in. That's very good news because they're harmless. They might be confusing or gross or perverse or violent or confusing or whatever, right? They're just thoughts and feelings and fantasies. They have nothing to do with action. That's actually what we're responsible for, right? If we act in some way, then we're responsible. But we are not responsible for the thoughts and feelings and fantasies. It's very difficult for people to really believe that, because some of us were raised to not believe that, we'll say. Some of us were raised to believe that to think something is as bad as doing it. That can't possibly be true, because only doing it is as bad as doing it. We don't even control those things that come to my mind. For instance, you've probably heard this before, but if you think you have good control over your mind and what comes to it, then absolutely do not think about a pink elephant. Don't picture a pink elephant. Don't think about it. Don't imagine a pink elephant at all. Right? You have no control. Now, the fact that we don't have any control about what flies into our minds, I think is very good news. Because to recognize that allows us to treat the contents of our minds with some equanimity, with curiosity, with I wonder why I'm feeling this way. And if you can insert that I wonder why in between the thing that flies into your mind and potential action, then you have a superpower. Because that's what gives you a choice about how to behave. Big feeling, big weirdo fantasy, whatever it is. If you don't wonder why, it's much more likely to squirt toward action. If you can imagine, let's see, we're going to talk about meditation in just a few minutes, but when you try and meditate, if you've ever tried to do some guided meditation, which I strongly suggest you do, it's going to ask you to sit in a comfortable position, quiet yourself, regulate your breathing a little bit, and then you're going to focus on something. The coolness at the end of your nose from breathing in, maybe you're breathing, but you're going to focus on that, and they're going to ask you to keep focusing on that. And then very quickly you're going to notice that your mind is going to start throwing things at you, and it's very difficult to resist them. As you practice any kind of mindfulness or meditative practice, it teaches you how gradually to just observe what comes to mind rather than grabbing it and wrestling with it, which is what we usually do. I'm not a meditation teacher or anything like that, but some people use the metaphor of, the thoughts that come to mind during meditation, that you're just supposed to like push them aside like you're holding a feather to a balloon. I hate that, but it might work for you. Or like blowing a cloud, something. I like the metaphor of being at the mall, very concrete, being at the mall and people watching. Like, you can watch the people, you can watch that, and you can watch that, but you don't go over and talk to them and grab them or take them, you're just observing them. That's how I like to treat these things. If you can allow yourself to think or feel anything with curiosity, you're much less likely to be overwhelmed. Because sometimes suppressing those things, suppressing feelings, suppressing thoughts, because they scare you or they're just objectionable somehow, that creates a pressure in the system that can produce anxiety or overwhelm. That doesn't mean that that's not the only reason you're anxious, but it does cause anxiety. Let's see here. If we allow ourselves to be curious, we start getting control over our behavior, of course. And the surest way of heading off potential overwhelm by big feelings is by being curious and asking ourselves why. Because if you ask yourself why am I feeling that way? You have interrupted something that is otherwise pretty automatic. I remember somebody gave me this brilliant advice, which is only kind of successful with my kids when they were misbehaving. And my go-to was yelling, or yelling even louder, which was very ineffective. Kind of satisfying, totally ineffective. Somebody taught us that we should just, this is for slightly older kids, just to interrupt the kid doing whatever the thing is, and to ask them, what should you be doing right now? And it usually leads to like befuddlement because you're not tangling with them. You're just asking them to wonder, what should you be doing right now? And then they have to think about it for a sec. Didn't always work, but that's kind of what I'm talking about here. You're interrupting this near automatic flow by saying, why am I feeling this way? I think it's a superpower. So we can either avoid feeling the overwhelm that comes with a threat by observing them, by being curious about them, or we can allow ourselves to simply have them, ride them out, and know that we're going to be okay. It's very difficult if you think about big feelings on a scale of 0 to 10, and 10 is the most overwhelmed, horrible thing you could possibly feel. It's very difficult to turn around with some of the techniques we'll talk about in a second. It's very difficult to turn them around once they've reached about an 8 or a 9, right? It's sort of crossed a threshold where it's just gonna go and you're gonna have to ride it out. If anybody here has had panic attacks, you kind of know what I'm talking about. They are terrible. People feel like they are going to die. You're not gonna die, but you feel like you're gonna die. And until you'll tell yourself, if this is panic, this isn't heart, but that's only after you've gone to the ER 3 or 4 times in the past 6 months because you had the same symptom. Once you can tell yourself, like, this is a panic attack, doctor taught me how to breathe, it's not working, but you know that you're going to be okay, that you can ride it out and you're going to be okay. Why don't we talk about some of those techniques? The easiest techniques to deal with, and again, this is usually based on 0 through 8. Once you've crossed the threshold, I think you're in for it, right? But if it's in the build-up to overwhelm, rather than the overwhelm, these first couple can be really helpful. And you all kind of do them already anyway, right? Any kind of healthful distraction is good. There are less healthy distractions. But if you can distract yourself with a book, a movie, a song, a conversation with somebody, a phone call, that can help a lot. Because it's not bad for you. Might be bad at 3 a.m. for the person you're calling, but still they love you and they'll be helpful to you and you'll return the favor someday. That's a healthy distraction. Unhealthy distractions, which do work, are things like polluting yourself somehow or numbing yourself out with drugs or alcohol. Some people cut, and it's kind of gross, but it's actually rather effective in turning off or at least redirecting feelings. But that's not so healthy. It's not so good for you. The disengagement is the same thing. And I'm going to talk about one specific technique for that in a few moments when we talk about grounding exercises. The relaxation exercises, you kind of already know. Everybody probably already knows how to do what they call square breathing. I have no idea why they call it square breathing because it seems so round. That's when it's intentional breathing, where you're breathing in through your nose very deeply to a count of 4, and holding it for a second, and then exhaling to a count of 4, and then repeating that for a minute. If you do that, you are going to feel more relaxed. The way anxiety takes up residence in our chests and our breathing, shallow breathing, tightness, that is completely incompatible with those symptoms. It's brilliant, and it's free. You don't have to see me, right? There are other form of relaxation exercises people do, like progressive muscle relaxation. Takes a little bit more time, but it's perfect for bed, where you sort of lie comfortably, but then start at your toes, and then flex them for 3 or 4 seconds, and then let them go. And then the next joint, you flex that 3 or 4 seconds, and then you do your ankle. And basically you're working up your whole body, hands, arms, chest, neck, face, progressively. And by the time you've done that, you have absolutely relaxed your body. But you can't just do that at Kroger, because that would be weird. Next is meditation and mindfulness, which that's the one you probably can't do very easily on your own, because somebody's going to have to help you learn how to do it, because it can be extremely disturbing and frustrating. And you kind of think, well, I'm terrible at this. I'm never going to be able to do this. You are. You just have to stick with it. And there's a bunch of apps out there now that almost all of them give you kind of a free version, at least for a bit. I mean, to get all the bells and whistles, I think you have to pay. But if you've seen those apps, I'm sure, like the first one I think was something I'm not remembering right now, but the Calm app is good, C-A-L-M. That's a great one. I love the Waking Up one, just because I like the guy's voice better than the others. 10% Happier, that's a great one and a great podcast. They all kind of work the same way. They're introducing you to the basics of meditation. They're guiding you through exercises. And the nice thing about it is if you've never done it, it's only going to take 3 minutes initially. Not easy somehow, but it's only 3 minutes, and we all have time for that. The better able we are to meditate and then to just be able to observe our thoughts or whatever hits our mind, that is going to generalize to us in terms of dealing with feelings more broadly. That's why all the therapists, I mean, everybody's suggesting learning how to meditate. It's really quite good for you. Lastly, I want to talk about grounding exercises. This one can even interrupt like 8s on that scale. Grounding exercises are sophisticated distractions from whatever's scaring you. Sometimes it's traumatic reenactment. Sometimes they're just overwhelmed with big feelings. But grounding exercises can really help. And the initial step for any grounding exercise is sitting still in a comfortable chair and putting both your feet flat on the ground. There's something about the experience of anxiety for us that makes us spin and make us feel detached. Literally grounding ourselves, both feet on the ground flat, is a great way to start. Here's an example of what therapists will teach patients. Place your feet firmly flat on the ground, just because anxiety can make us feel unmoored or floating. 2, stating the day and time. Just tell me the date and time. And then take slow, deep breaths. Then asking them to simply describe what they can see in your office. Reminding them that they're in a safe place. Like, you hear how my voice sort of changes to that register, that like relaxation register. It drives me crazy. And observing their immediate surroundings and describing items in the room. That's one way of doing it. Another very common way of doing grounding exercises is by having people search the room using all 5 senses. Asking them, name 5 things you can see in the room. Name 4 things that you can touch. Name 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. 1 thing you can taste. By focusing on those things, you are taking them out of anxiety, which is almost always anticipatory, and putting them in the present moment, the here and now. And that helps people be more gathered and de-escalate and feel less floaty and unmoored. And I sort of teach my patients those techniques as needed. But I got to tell you, there are probably therapists who are better at those things than I am. My bias is toward helping them tolerate how they feel and be curious about how they feel, even if it's big and scary. Because, again, the feelings, in my opinion, always make some sense on some level. And I like honoring the feeling, even if it's gross or objectionable, because it makes sense. It's never the only way that somebody feels, but it's always there for a reason. And I like helping people explore that, but without judgment and having them be curious about it. So those are the formal thoughts I had for tonight that I wanted to present, which leaves us lots of time for any ideas or questions you guys might have. If you do. Sir?
What happens when you get ambushed?
As a therapist, or you mean a human getting ambushed like in the world?
You get ambushed by somebody, an unexpected person comes up, just pisses you off. What do you?
Yeah. If it's, let me start with a more extreme example. Like if somebody's literally ambushing you, like out behind the corner of a building and tries to mug you or something.
No, I don't mean that.
You don't.
I'm using it as an analogy.
Okay.
People are they verbally abuse you out of the blue.
Yeah. So the question was, what do you do if you're ambushed by someone being verbally abusive to you out of the blue? Your reaction to that's going to depend initially on, do I know the person? Do I not know the person? Right? If it's a total stranger, it's probably going to scare us. And our brains have evolved to do things very simply when we're scared. The part of our brain that regulates fight or flight will start dumping the necessary chemicals so that we can run, which is probably the best thing to do if we're actually in danger. If it's just verbal abuse, that's objectionable, but not necessarily dangerous. Although it's just weird enough that it could feel dangerous, because why would someone do that, right? Oh, it's absolutely hurtful. But in that moment, I would still say the most useful thing we can do is turn on our heels and walk or run away. We don't have to run, probably. My father-in-law was in the Navy, and he was trained in judo. And he was talking about it at some point while he was alive. He talked about it and said that, and he was a black belt. He said that one of the most important things that he learned as a black belt was to run with confidence. Meaning, if you had to stay and fight, you could, because you're trained to do it, but that doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense to use your feet to leave the situation. In this moment, if somebody is coming at you, because yelling at you or really using foul language or something, that is a physical event, even though it's verbal, because it still hits us like that. I think disengagement's the best thing to do if it's possible. Do you have a notion otherwise?
Let's say I'm in a situation where I'm with a group of people and you don't want to leave the situation. Let's say you're on a baseball team and someone says some smart ass thing.
Sure.
I don't want to run.
Nope, you don't want to run, you don't want to leave at all. So you would have to treat that moment and that tomfoolery that was coming your way as just noise. Some ridiculous thing. You know you have support behind you, right? It's relatively safe. If it happens out in the world more randomly than somebody jawboning on a ball field, because they do that, then it's going to feel more scary, because we're not accustomed to people just coming up to us and being like loud and rude. But it's going to set off our alarms. And in those moments, I don't think we have to wonder why we're feeling that way. You can later, but just getting out of there makes the most sense to me. A little trickier when it's family or Thanksgiving or something, right? That it's hard to, you can just leave, but it's very hard to do that. Any other examples of like moments where you might be confronted with a difficult decision? Something that evokes sort of big feelings? Yeah,
So follow-up question.
sure.
So just treat it like it's just noise.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? How do you kind of talk yourself through that?
Right. So did you hear what she said? Just how is it that you talk yourself through just treating it like noise? I'm thinking of an analogy of if you've ever played any team sports like baseball, hockey, there is a lot of jaw jacking that goes on, a lot. And it's part of a strategy, it's part of what they do to try and unnerve the opponents. And so there's all this chippiness and stuff that happens. That you can treat like noise, like wah, 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 like Charlie Brown's teacher. That's what I'd like us to be able to do. Because usually someone who's being rude like that, even somebody in sports, it's not personal. Because if it's a stranger, it can't possibly be personal because they don't know us. It's only rude and objectionable, right? So to know that it's not personal and this person's, maybe they have a mental illness, or maybe...
What if they're jealous of you? And they're going at you.
Like to fight you?
You know, little subtle digs you get.
I don't get them a lot, but I get what you mean. Like someone who's clearly calling you out, who might be jealous of your stature or your whatever, anything. Those things I would still try and treat as terrible noise, because why would we want to take someone seriously because of their jealousy, right? But people can be rather rude. And if you have a history of having endured shaming incidents, or if you have a history of verbal abuse when you were little or something like that, that can prime you to have reactions in the present moment that'll feel much, much worse than the jerk at the Hamlin pub or somebody who's making noise. Please.
What would you suggest to if you're not the target, but you get those emotions anyway? I can give you an example. You're sitting in a board meeting and the coworker's getting chewed out by the boss, or you're watching your kid's Little League game, the coach is chewing out one of the kids, or you're at dinner.
Yep.
Husband's chewing out his wife at another table, and it's loud, and you can feel those feelings inside, like
You sure can.
do something. And you have a choice. You can sort of extricate yourself, but there's also a sense of right or justice, or those feelings that rise up. This isn't quite right.
So that's a really interesting point as well. Those vicarious moments of trauma might be a little strong, but it's vicarious trauma. To witness something awful happening out there, even though it's actually not coming your way. So in any of those situations, we can, as we're listening to what you said, probably we can imagine how we're going to feel in that moment. Intensely uncomfortable. Like if somebody seems like they're actually in danger, like somebody being very cruel and physically looming over somebody, we might have the impulse to want to intervene. That's probably going to run right into the impulse to not do anything because we're scared. Because I think the vicarious trauma of it scares us, rightfully. We might push through the scared to intervene, and maybe that's exactly the right thing to do occasionally. Probably mostly not. Watching somebody fighting with the umpire at a Little League game, even though it's not you at all, not even a parent you know, that's intensely uncomfortable. Because that's empathy, right? We're not just observing that one, we're actually feeling the effects of being hit by it.
Because from a personal standpoint, those are cases where I'm going to choose to intervene or not intervene.
Mm-hmm.
Those are often the cases I'll replay after.
For sure.
How I might have reacted differently, or I wish I would have, or it will stick with me long term.
Right. The moments when, especially when we choose to not intervene, we're usually stuck with that for a bit, or even something like you were describing. Like a moment, maybe we did turn away, even though somebody was being super rude. But we're going to replay that in our minds like, gosh, I wish I would have, if that parent was being that kind of a creep to that umpire or that coach, I wish I would just told him to cool it or something. You comment?
Isn't that called trauma? I mean,
Broadly.
we have been the victim of somebody being mean to us or whatever the scenario is, isn't that being an empath and then PTSD or trauma? We replay because
Sure.
it feels too uncomfortable but familiar.
It's kind of a matter of degree, right? Typically, we think of trauma as something that affects us to the point where our very lives were threatened. Someone being mugged or raped or tortured or car crashes that were terrifying, those kinds of things. But with sustained trauma or sustained moments of helplessness and terror and awfulness, we can absolutely be post-traumatic in that our it's not even just it's our brains that are now sensitized to it, so that other things can trigger it. Much milder things can trigger it. An argument in the Kroger in Papa Joe's parking lot, not always Kroger, can affect us deeply if we've had a history. If our parents screamed and fought and tortured each other for years, you survived it, but it's absolutely a part of you. You could absolutely have an old reaction that's brought forward by this new thing. People fighting over carts or something stupid. So yeah, it's traumatic, if not exactly traumatic. But yes, it's going to follow you. So in the more extreme forms of like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, people do have flashbacks and reoccurrences and intrusive dreams because of horrible stuff they've had to survive. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
How do you respond to someone who's having a panic attack? You're in the room with them. My daughter has real high anxiety.
Yeah.
And she has a full-blown panic attack. And so my first reaction is like, I'm going to fix this.
Yeah.
Or get through this, but...
So yeah, absolutely. You feel helpless, she feels helpless. So I would look to like the grounding exercises, which is if you're able to be there, and sometimes you can even just do it on the phone if you're not together, but asking her to do those things I mentioned. Probably start with telling her that she's safe, reminding her that this is a panic attack and that she's going to be okay, but then actually physically doing the grounding exercises. Put your feet on the ground. Tell me something you see in the room. Yeah, those are really, go on YouTube. They'll teach you all sorts of these kinds of techniques. It's the best thing I know to interrupt those. But just the fact, we just do better often if there's somebody there. We can't always be there, right? But if you're there with her and you can hold a hand or walk her through that and tell her that she's going to be safe, she'll survive it. She'll survive it. She'll survive it even if you're not there. It'll just be more terrible, but she'll still be fine. That's very hard to convince someone when they're in the middle of it, though. So your presence means a lot if you happen to be there. So that's what I would do. Yeah.
I still think there's a fine line between letting the bully get the last word and you taking the high road and walking away. Is that...
I think I would agree with you generally that if somebody is being that kind of rude, that kind of a bully, it would take a lot for me, but I would eventually have to do something about it verbally. I'm not going to beat somebody up.
That's why did I just ignore this person's text
instead of saying like you're being rude, leave me alone.
Instead of saying what a stupid answer, a childish answer you said, I just left it alone.
Leaving it alone is running with confidence in the judo way, because why do you want to engage a childish man, right? But it does leave us with that little inkling of like, but he shouldn't get away with this. But he's an asshole. Sorry. You know what I mean? Like, so that's going to be true whether you say something or not. And he was that way before you met him. Probably going to be that way next week. It doesn't feel just, though, does it? It's like, oh no, the police are supposed to be punished and supposed to be stopped. They're not supposed to get away with that.
They want you to engage with them.
This is what I told one of my patients recently, who he'd gone on a family vacation, and one of his siblings closest to him, they torture each other. Like, how was your trip? That was really good, except and I were fighting the whole time. Oh, that sounds fun. What were you fighting about? And stupid stuff, of course. And so I told him the story, actually, about the judo, about Davy. And he hated it at first, the run with confidence part, until I told him that's the secret. I said, look, your ability to walk away from trouble is a superpower. Your ability to walk away from your brother's trouble is a superpower. And it's going to help you. You're not going to get in trouble. You're going to have a better time. But here's the super secret that makes it amazing. It's going to drive him crazy. Right? Same for the person I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Using empathy, I realize that he's not working at his office. And he's stuck in his house with his 2 kids and his wife, who's also stuck with him all day long.
Sure.
He's probably jealous of me because I'm not in that.
Could well be. Could well be. And he decides to throw shade at you because of that. I mean, if he's a longtime friend, you can invite him out for a coffee. I would too. And then you're just going to have to shoulder that little bit of you that's like, this should not stand. I should have. But that's assuming that he's a reasonable person like you who's going to respond to reasonable intervention rather than that other word I used, which means he's probably not going to respond very well.
But I like what you really said. It probably burned them up.
That is an absolute bonus, for sure. Please.
Yeah, so I work in a pretty intense work environment, and there's been times during like meetings that I have to be actively engaged in where I have really big feelings. And when I have like negative feelings, it's hard for me to continue to like engage and think without feeling clouded.
Mm-hmm.
And those are situations where I have to actively participate. I can't just disengage and like run away because I'm in a meeting and I can't really do any of the like techniques in the moment.
Right.
So how do I, in those moments where I have to like, you know, lead a meeting or talk, be able to, I don't want to say like put my feelings aside, but like not be clouded by those.
Right. Intense anxiety has this way of clouding our thinking. We just don't, we're just not as clear because we're scared. Wanting to bolt makes sense physiologically. Can I ask a question about this? Okay. So is it like an inside stress of moments, like a...
Yeah, so I think it would just be like comments or questions that make me feel maybe like less confident or maybe even like my work is in question or things like that.
Right. Okay. So they're questioning your integrity or how smart you are or what a contributor. Of course. Yeah, no, this is all about your interpretation. They might be doing that. Probably doubt it. But if you feel like you're being questioned like that, it's going to jack your anxiety. So one of the things you can do, knowing that, does it happen every meeting?
Not every meeting, but some meetings.
If it happens at enough meetings, I would suggest doing something before the meeting that kind of preps you to relax. And which can range from simply, this will sound cheesy, but simply listening to soothing music. Some people like classical music. Whatever is soothing to you, probably not screamo or gangster rap, unless that really soothes you. It might. Indeed. So something that calms you before. What we know for sure is that people, when you know you're going to face a stressful event, if you listen to something like soothing music beforehand, the people that did that versus the control group that didn't, they recovered quicker. Their cortisol levels went down quicker afterward if they'd done that little bit of prep. Some people, and this one sounds really cheesy, but it's actually really helpful. Some people will make up 3x5 cards with positive affirmations. I know what this reminds people of. Remember that skit on Saturday Night Live with Stuart Smalley, who's looking in the mirror and like, I'm good enough and I'm smart enough and doggone people like me? Funny stuff. But actual positive affirmations about that I'm bright, I've got this, I know my material, whatever the positive affirmations are. If you go through those a couple times, it counteracts the quiet messages you've told yourself over the years, which makes you vulnerable to those moments because you've told yourself lousy stories about yourself. So that can help you prep as well. And I would also put both your feet on the ground. Like when you start feeling it, do you flush? Do you get red?
Yeah, I do.
Nice. So like it just screams like, I'm nervous. Just put your feet on the ground so that you feel like you're not going to float away with it. And of course, you already know this, but you're going to survive it, even if it's unpleasant. And none of those things that you tell yourself, the anxiety lies, they're just not true. I mean, you occasionally might screw up or you might not know something, but probably not. Sir?
What would be your encouragement for potentially taking things too far as far as you're over healthfully distracting yourself or overly disengaged and should be re-engaged? So you're too neutral. You know what I mean?
Right.
More roller coaster in your emotions than just.
Okay, so like if there's an overcorrection. Did you hear the comment? Okay, so it can be, and this is, let me use the analogy of like childhood stuff. If you have made an unfortunate choice of parents and it's a chaotic home or an abusive home, you will survive it more than likely, and you will have a set of coping mechanisms that you put in place, usually pretty brilliant. But those same coping mechanisms then that were brilliant, often in adulthood, are less adaptive. Like if you learn to steel yourself off and feel nothing and put on character armor, and that's brilliant, that's less ideal when you're in love at 25 and your partner's like, you're just not emotionally available, right? That's when we have to slowly allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Because of that overcorrection, I'm more inclined, at least with the feelings that I think are metabolizable, I'm more inclined to have people just feel them, sit with them, and know that they can ride them out. Because then there doesn't have to be the overcorrection to like steeled self or robot self. We can always do that. I mean, you can always get numb. You can always steal yourself away if you need to. But it's to your point, the overcorrection is problematic for us. Like it did make sense, but now it doesn't make sense. Yeah.
So I know you said you also work with couples. What would you give in terms of advice around conflict resolution for someone who is more like has a lot of emotions, with someone who maybe is more adapted to that, where they have less emotions and are more stoic?
You would, in the couples work, did you hear the question? Okay. In the couples work, you would, because the nice thing about couples work is they show you exactly what they do. There's nothing subtle about it. And so in the moment, you can point out like, hey, did you notice that when you were getting really worked up and excited for reasons that make sense, did you notice that he gradually sort of slumped his shoulders and shut down? There was some kind of too muchness there that just didn't work very well. And then by drawing their attention to the process and giving them a chance to rework it a little bit, it can help. Or just teaching them how to communicate the very same thing but in a modified way so that it doesn't shut down the other person. Does that make sense?
What about using the word that keeps coming to my head is assertiveness, assertiveness training.
Sure. Some people need assertiveness training.
You talked about those two kids fighting in the car, and you're telling one of them to take the high road and walk. He can't leave that car. He's got to be assertive.
Yeah, he's got to tell his brother to button it, right? Yeah, if there's no escape from it, then there can be something more assertive. A lot of people confuse assertive with aggressive. Aggressive's not a great idea unless you're actually in danger. Assertive actually is a good idea, but isn't easy for us. So,
That's what I'm trying to do. I had a little battle with that guy who texted me. I wasn't assertive. I took the high road and just didn't respond to it.
you win.
I will, but was I being assertive?
You were being assertive in the most adaptive direction, but you weren't being directly assertive with him. Because there's that part of you, and I totally get this, there's a part of you that wanted to tell him off. Tell him to go, tell him off, right? If I thought that would be useful, other than temporarily pleasurable, I'd say, yeah, have at it. But that's just going to exacerbate things, probably. Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out what was the assertive action to do. I guess it was just ignoring the whole thing.
I think it's brilliant. In fact, and you know this even from in the tension that you're feeling now, that the more difficult thing to do was the adaptive thing, which is disengage from the fool. Because you're fighting through like years of being trained as a dude and a boy who's supposed to be tough, and you're having to counteract some of that old stuff in order to do this more adaptive thing. So I actually think it takes a little bit more guts and a little bit more assertiveness to run with confidence, even though I know it sounds terrible, doesn't it?
I know, but I agree with you.
Yeah. Last thought before we interrupt? Sure.
So you mentioned naming and differentiating feelings. Do you have any suggestions on how to improve your ability to do that? Or if there are books or...
Sure. I mean, you can look up online. I mean, this is a kind of basic thing that we do. People that work with kids use them all the time. There are these wheels of feelings, right? And there's colored quadrants that have kind of the big general feelings, and then all the different subtleties between them, the differentiations. And so you can kind of look at them and practice identifying, how am I feeling right now on here on this wheel. If you're working with somebody professionally, they can probably walk you through that as well. It's such a great gift. The better able you are to know what you're feeling and be able to articulate it, it just helps so much. But we're not raised to be very good at that. Boys especially. We sort of do a disservice to our boys. I'm an exception, of course, because my mom's here. We raise our boys to not be very good with feelings because it's not tough. And then you have boys that are breaking things, later rather than figuring out how to deal with them some other way. So, well, thanks for your attention tonight. I appreciate you coming out and listening and contributing. Nice to meet you guys. Thanks.